I know for a fact that I'm not alone when I say that I've literally sunk countless hours over the years playing Doom. Not just because of the basically limitless number of mods and level packs out there, but because the gameplay of Doom is what I'd call pretty damn close to perfect. I mean, there was a reason that the term Doom clone was used a lot in the 90s to describe other first-person shooters. And if you've been paying much attention to the indie scene over the last couple of years, you might have noticed that there's been a bit of a resurgence in this particular style of FPS games, being coined boomer shooters for some reason, with a few games like Dusk, Ion Fury, and Medieval, and Strafe, Sulaco, Wrath, Aeon of Ruin, Project Warlock, Nightmare Reaper, and Ultrakill. And H-Rot, Graven, Blood West, Dread Templar, Viscera Fest, and okay, bloody hell, there's quite a few of them now.
That's one Doom, Space Marine.
Case in point here is the recently released and finally out of early access Proteus, the Kickstarter funded shooter that's been in development for a few years now from Bounding Box Software. I wasn't actually made fully aware of this game until a friend of mine recommended I check it out at the beginning of the year, even though I think G-Man Lives made a video about it. I played the first couple of levels and was very impressed by what I saw. I also then stopped playing as well because of its early access status at the time and decided to wait for the full release, which is now here. So because I haven't really been following this game from the start, I'm not going to be doing a comparison to the earlier builds and talking about what may or may not have changed. I'm just going to be talking about the game as it is now upon the full release. Also, all of my footage was captured from the PS4 version, and I'll include a few pointers on improving the experience for console players. So, let's take a look, shall we?
Now this is a force to be reckoned with.
Now, if I had to explain what Proteus is in the most layman terms, it would probably be the brutal Doom mod meets the Quake 2 engine, despite the fact the game is actually running on the Unity engine. The game definitely has influences from a lot of other shooters, but you can definitely tell that the main influence behind Proteus is Doom, and count how many times I say Doom in this video. The story, not that there is much of one, feels pretty similar to Doom, involving outer world research facilities and portals to other dimensions leading to an invasion of monsters. Much like the original Doom, this is essentially just set dressing for the gameplay and your excuse to be killing things, which is perfectly fine because this is something that Proteus does extremely well. Proteus utilizes a roster of enemies that should feel familiar to anyone who's played Doom, which helps reinforce the retro feel they were going for. You've got your standard zombies and shotgun sergeants, then you've got the fireball tossing fiends, which are essentially just imps. You've got the charging beasts known as lungers, which are clearly modelled after pinkies. Skullfish are the lost souls, and yes, unfortunately there is a pain elemental equivalent that does its older brother proud while pissing me off. Oh, and how can I forget the chain gunners, everyone's favourite hit scanners from Doom 2, that are even tougher now. Then there are also the bloaters.
What the fuck is that?
Goddamn bloater!
What?
No, not those bloaters. Bloaters are this game's answer to the Cacodemon from Doom, and these monsters are the general fodder you're going to be fighting throughout the majority of the campaign in Proteus. There's a few other enemies too, like the Slayer, which has attacks similar to the Archivile, and these other monsters that can empower other monsters later on, which can make some of the fights pretty chaotic. You can get lungers that also fire projectiles, which is low-key terrifying.
Terminated.
Where the brutal Doom aspect comes in is that all of the monsters have a high level of violent detail in the ways they can be eviscerated by your weapons in combat. Limbs and entire torsos can be removed from the enemies, heads can be exploded, and a well-placed rocket can render a crowd of enemies into a pile of tiny body parts, as well as painting that area into a new shade of red. And you can expect pretty much every level in Proteus to be refurbished with blood. That's how kind of ridiculously over the top the violence is. It's kind of similar to the game Killing Floor 2 as well, now that I think of it. Another cool thing about Proteus, and probably one of the more unique aspects to it, is that there are actually two different sets of assets for all the monsters. There are the fantastic looking 3D models, which I spent the majority of my playthroughs with, but also classic 2D sprites, again mirroring how the original Doom used 2D sprites, all complete with dismemberments and have a suitably pixelated look to them. So there's basically two different styles here for people who prefer the sprite style enemies of the Doom engine or build engine games, and then the chunkier 3D models for folks who like that Quake engine era look.
Jeez. What was up with that big guy?
The weapon lineup in Proteus is pretty much every gun from the Doom and Quake games, with a total of 18 weapons. However, I actually didn't get to try them all out, as some of them you need to unlock through secret hunting. I think I missed about 4 of them. But nonetheless, the weapon lineup should feel very familiar to FPS veterans, with your basic pistol, shotgun, chain gun, and rocket launcher, followed by the fancier super shotgun, a plasma rifle, and a lightning gun. All of these weapons feel incredibly satisfying to use and are extremely effective at gunning down the hordes of monsters throughout the game, with great sound effects and reactions from enemies providing a good sense of feedback. For instance, the shotgun is likely to blow enemies apart, whereas the submachine guns are going to shred enemies into tiny pieces.
You gonna chop me up into tiny pieces?
To then add further depth to your combat options, almost every weapon has a secondary fire function with different tactical advantages to them. So, the super shotgun is a 4-barreled shotgun that fires one shot at a time normally, or it fires all 4 barrels at once with the secondary fire, completely brutalizing whatever is unfortunate enough to be in the way. The lightning gun's secondary fire essentially turns it into a scoped railgun and is needed for quite a few stages that have sniper enemies. And the plasma rifle has a tracking tag you hit your enemies with, which your projectiles will then lock onto and then even travel around corners to hit their target. It reminded me instantly of the bullseye gun from the Resistance games on PlayStation 3. Which, as a side note, I think definitely needs some kind of remaster. Sony, don't remake Horizon Zero Dawn, give us a Resistance Trilogy remaster.
God damn these things!
All of this pretty much non-stop action is accompanied by another incredible soundtrack from Andrew Holsholt. This guy has been making music for quite a few of the aforementioned boomer shooters like Dusk and Medieval, but he also did the music for the Doom Eternal DLCs, and I've got to admit, parts of the soundtrack felt just a little reminiscent of Doom Eternal, which isn't a bad thing.
Born to be wild.
Across the campaign of Prodeus, there's just over 25 levels, as well as a few trial challenges that will take you about 8 to 10 hours on a first playthrough without getting all of the secrets. The level design throughout this campaign was always really impressive, despite the core gameplay loop still being the same as Doom in that you'll be flicking switches and searching for keycards. Combined with that Quake 2 engine aesthetic, it made for quite an experience. There's lots of jagged geometry similar to how games of that era looked, along with deliberately pixelated looking texture work, that quite often it does feel like you could be playing a game from that time. But then you see the scope of some of the levels and detail put into some areas, particularly a few set pieces that could only be possible with the technology that we have now. One stage later in the campaign really impressed me with its deforming and retracting floors that open up to reveal more and more of the stage. There are lots of secrets too, a lot of which are pretty well hidden, but there's also quite a few that you simply can't reach on a first playthrough. These secrets reward you with ore that you can spend at the game's store, where many of the extra guns are required, but also a few abilities too, like a dash mechanic and a double jump. Once you've acquired these upgrades, you can return to previous stages, as Proteus uses an overworld, similar to Super Mario or the original Crash Bandicoot. I finished my playthrough with 66% completion, so that should perhaps give you an indication of the level of secret hunting there is in this game.
Anything? Anything?
Now, in terms of negative aspects to the game, I don't have that many, and a couple of them are console specific. One thing that I found odd throughout the campaign was the behaviour of monsters in certain places, in that there were times where monsters simply didn't move at all, despite not being in a location that would logically restrict their movement. I mean, it makes sense when fiends spawn on pillars, that stuff happens in Doom too, but there's just lots of instances where enemies are just rooted to the spot for no real reason, even some of the flying enemies. I can't tell if this was done for balancing reasons, but it just felt kind of weird. Even in the first phase of the final boss, he was just standing there letting me sink rockets into him. It should go without saying too then that there is quite a difficulty spike in the second half of the campaign, especially once the enemies who can empower other monsters are introduced. It's during some of these sections that can be just a little bit bullshit, as suddenly almost every monster fires projectiles at you, and not every arena where these enemies turn up are designed for great player mobility, which resulted in a few cheap feeling deaths. This is more of a nitpick I guess, but the campaign does have a sort of similar structure to Doom, with the game ending in the Chaos Dimension, its version of Hell. Whereas Doom had an entire episode of 9 levels set in Hell, Proteus pretty much has just the one level, which I found a bit disappointing, as I was kind of hoping to see a bit more of that setting with the Quake 2 aesthetic. But like I said, this could be more of a nitpick than anything. The last couple of things, as I said, are console specific and not entirely faults with the game itself. One of the first things I recommend you do if you're playing Proteus on console is remap the dash button from R3 to circle, just like in Doom Eternal. Trying to dash by clicking down on the right thumbstick just isn't comfortable. Also, for some reason on console, the aim assist function is on by default, and I strongly recommend turning that off straight away, as this soft locks to the nearest enemy, and when you're trying to take out a more powerful monster that has other monsters in front of it, you're gonna have a hard time lining up a shot in the heat of the moment. And finally, don't bother using the D-pad to cycle through weapons, just use the weapon wheel. It does pause the action when you do this, but for me personally it was better than fumbling through several button presses in a hurry to get a new gun out. Obviously on PC this is a complete non-issue, as you can just flick the mouse wheel or use the number keys on the keyboard on the fly.
Here we go.
Proteus is just an absolute blast to play from start to finish, and I think it has definitely achieved its goal in creating a retro-inspired shooter experience enhanced by modern technology. The gameplay has that same addictive quality that Doom had, combined with its over-the-top gore has easily made it one of my favourite games to come out this year. To make it even better is that the game comes with its own level editor on PC, which allows people to learn the engine and make their own custom levels to further add to the game's longevity. And naturally, whenever there's a level editor for an FPS, it doesn't take long for people to start remaking levels from older games like Doom and Quake. All of this content is cross-platform too, so you can play these custom levels on both PC and console. I honestly cannot recommend Proteus enough. If you're a fan of shooters, and particularly retro boomer shooters, you definitely do not want to skip this one. Until next time, stay safe out there, try to avoid opening portals to demonic dimensions, and I'll see you all in the next video.